Dr. Grace Chen. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, EMDRIA-approved consultant, and EMDR-certified clinician. I'm based in Andover, Massachusetts, and my clinical work primarily involves working with adults individually or as a couple, integrating EMDR with attachment theory and polyvagal theory. Every season, if you are EMDRIA, meaning EMDR International Association, if you are the EMDRIA member, you probably receive this magazine called Go With That every season. I love this little magazine because it's really written by the real clinician doing the real work on the ground. And usually after finishing this quarterly magazine, I often have some idea about certain topics or working with certain populations. If you ever sat in an EMDR consultation group, especially the basic training consultation group, you feel like the standard protocol just doesn't capture the complex needs of your C-PTSD clients. If you feel that way, then you are not alone. And as a consultant, I often feel this like a conflict internally that try to balance everyone's needs and then stick to the as clear as possible, the basic training, the standard protocol, while in the meantime fulfill every individual consultee's specific needs, especially the complex PTSD clients' situation are often so very diverse. So if you ever felt that sense of like, it's just not answering my question, then you're not alone. It is a massive clinical hurdle to figure out how to bridge that gap. We are in luck this season because in April I received this, spring 2026. Yeah, I received the magazine, and this season it's actually featuring EMDR and complex trauma. So today we are going to dive into this topic, and I'm going to extract from this people, the clinicians, the experts who write, and then their articles being featured in this magazine. And I will also summarize the common themes and see how it will all stack up against the New Haven trauma competency standard. The very first article is Thomas Zimmerman's key decision points in working more effectively with clients with complex trauma in EMDR therapy. Thomas Zimmerman highlights one foundational rule, that is, EMDR therapy is not a machine that you can just cram people through. Standard EMDR approaches often fail with complex trauma clients because the core task requires the client to tolerate activation, slow down, be present, and notice. And this task directly conflicts with their survival strategies. So how do we as a clinician to adapt? The adjustment begins right away in phase one. History taking takes time, and then stretching this phase across multiple sessions is almost always necessary. It is not safe or effective to ask a client to list the worst things that have ever happened to them during their first session. Instead, we as a therapist must focus on building the relationship, assessing for dissociation, and listening closely to adaptive information. That will eventually help to heal the trauma. When going into the phase two, traditional visualization sources often fall short, according to him. He recommends that using the dip your toe in resources instead. This exercise will prioritize consent, often incredibly brief and short, and then excessively concrete. So, for example, he offered a hand breathing exercise. Rather than a spacious mindfulness practice, the therapist will ask the client to simply notice the temperature of their out breath on their hand for just a few seconds. And this will safely externalize the experience because noticing sensation inside the body can be highly triggering for some trauma survivors. He also uses a metaphor called boat and a whale. Essentially, EMDR help the client to resolve trauma by connecting difficult memories to a client's existing adaptive information. A client need a big enough boat of the adaptive information to land a massive whale of a traumatic memory. That is what the bold and well means. It's that adaptive information is like that positive life learning current capacity. That is adaptive capacity in order to hold the well. The well is the trauma memory. So in essentially, a client needs a big enough boat of the adaptive information to lend a massive well of traumatic memory. So if the client lacks this boat, then therapists must front load it through psychoeducation, part work, or attachment figure resourcing. When it is finally time to process the memories, therapists must resist the standard training to start with the first and worst trauma. With complex trauma, these core wounds are where the client has the smallest boat. So instead, we need to start at the intersection of what is productive for their current stability and what is tolerable for their nervous system right now. As processing begins, therapists must actively protect clients from flooding. Trauma often wants to explode into the room, so therapists should use restricted protocol to help clients digest memories in tiny, manageable pieces. Any new memories that popped up should be contained if the client's window of tolerance is already full. By tackling small target first, the therapist will help the client build the largest boat they need to safely process those core wounds. Ultimately, what he suggests is that EMDR therapists must let your deep knowledge of complex trauma shape the therapy, and you should always ensure that you meet your client exactly where they need to be. The next article is Mark Brayne's article, Complex Trauma, EMDR Pacing and Attachment as Organizing Lenses. Brayne views EMDR through an attachment-informed lens. According to him, in the traditional therapy, the central question is often what happened. But with complex trauma, he shifts the focus to how did this client learn to respond to what happened based on their early relationships. How did the client learn to respond to what happened based on their early relationships? So to understand this, he outlined two tracks of the processing. The first track focusing on the external trauma events. The second track addresses the internal attachment-informed meaning of the events. For example, deeply ingrained belief about your self-worth, the danger, and then expectations of repair. For clients with developmental trauma, track 2 is the true driving force of their distress, and focusing only on track 1 can lead to overwhelm. Because of this, traditional EMDR resourcing must be adapted. A standard safe place visualization can actually trigger complex trauma survivors if they historically associate isolation with fear or neglect. Instead, he recommended installing like a relational resources such as an imaginal figure, a nurturing figure, a protective figure, or a wise figure. And this will provide the nervous system with soothing safety that desperately needed and then lacking also during a client's formative years. And by the time to select a target for processing, he also said that a therapist must safely trace present-day distress back to its earliest roots. He suggested using the image, emotion, body, and belief framework. Instead of asking for a negative belief right away, according to him, client often states that negative cognition without genuine emotion. He suggests that therapists start with the image and body sensations and then allowing the true underlying belief to emerge organically. And when bridging back to these memories, therapists should use clear language, such as drop back in time. And then by doing that, therapists can bypass cognitive searching and drop the client directly into the relevant memory network. Once the processing begins, the clinician actively paces the nervous system using deliberate language and micro titrations. To safely manage your client's nervous system, clinicians should achieve micro-titration primarily through micro-adjustment of language. Rather than treating standard EMDR prompts interchangeably, he thinks that therapists should carefully select specific phrases based on the client's immediate emotional and somatic state. For example, go with that is used to support forward movement when the client's processing is fluid. Notice that can be used to deliberately anchor the client's awareness, and follow that will encourage the continuation of an unfolding narrative, and stay with that signal on contentment when the client is experiencing intense affect. Think about that. It's used to brief invite reflective integration when the client expresses a new insight. Also, micro-titration involves using present tense check-in language. So, for example, what are you noticing now instead of what did you notice? So this specific wording is crucial according to him because it keeps the client anchored in a dual attention within the therapeutic space. And it will prevent the client from shifting into a cognitive, analytical, or detached state. By continuously tracking the client's presence and making this precise moment-by-moment adjustment, the clinician can ensure the client stay at the productive stage of trauma processing without losing their capacity to regulate their emotions. The most critical element of his approach is what he called the tipping point. At least that's from my understanding, reading the article. According to him, a major error in therapy is letting a session run out until a childhood wound is still actively open. If that happens, it will reinforce the client's historical expectation of being abandoned in distress. So to prevent this, according to him, about 10 minutes before the session ends, the clinician must shift from meaning making to structure imaginal repair. The therapist can guide the client to imagine their childhood needs and then finally being met by their resource figures, and they will encoding a completely new protective outcome. So for example, what do your child's needs, and then invite the nurturing protective or wise figure to come to assist. Finally, the therapist must safely guide the client back across the bridge into the present day awareness. By building a relational container and carefully pacing the work, the therapist can avoid the common mistakes of rushing to repair, ensure that the client's deepest emotional meaning is fully revealed and safely resolved. The third article is Natalia Seho's article called Reconnecting with the Body, EMDR and Complex Trauma. Natalia Seho's article offers the insight on how unresolved complex trauma manifests physically and how EMDR therapists must be adapted to help the client safely reconnect with their bodies. According to the AIP model, we know that trauma is not just stored as a narrative memory. It is deeply encoded in our implicit, somatic, and autonomic systems. So in the case of complex trauma, especially those living in the chronic abuse, neglect, and attachment disruption, the nervous system learns that it is not safe to feel or to inhabit the body. And this connection is shaped not only by the abusive events that happened, but also by what did not happen. That is, that the absence of emotional attunement and co-regulation that didn't happen is also the trauma. And as a result, disconnecting from the body emerges as an adaptive survival strategy. So Seho noted that this body disconnection typically presented in two distinctive ways. The first one is somatoform dissociation. That is, the body remains accessible but express unresolved trauma through physical symptoms such as pain, numbness, fatigue, or gastrointestinal distress. And the second form is somatic dissociation. And this is a more profound disruption when the individual doesn't have access to bodily sensations altogether and feeling their bodies kind of distant, unreal, or it doesn't feel like my body is mine, that kind of feeling. And to treat this effectively, EMDR must shift its focus from reprocessing a single traumatic event to increasing the nervous system's capacity to tolerate internal experience. So phase two, the preparation phase, must be significantly extended because the body is not initially experienced as safe. Traditional safe place exercise may not work. Instead, the therapist must use gradual somatic resources. This might involve developing a calm place anchor and then reinforced by placing a hand on the chest, rubbing the chest, and to regain the awareness or grounding through the feet and the chair. Moving into the reprocessing phase, according to her, it requires extreme care. Therapists must rely on microprocessing rather than full exposure, using brief, carefully titrated sets of bilateral stimulation. The therapist must frequently pause for grounding and continuously monitor for signs of dissociation to prevent overwhelming the client. She said that moving too quickly can exacerbate somatic symptoms and trigger a system shutdown or further fragmentation. When EMDR is properly paced and then relationally attuned, improvement is often subtle, but it can be really meaningful, deeply meaningful to the client. Early changes looks like a reduction of extreme dissociation or like slightly increasing body awareness. Ultimately, the client gains increased autonomic flexibility, the ability to tolerate emotions physically without shutting down, and a restored integrated sense that their body safely belongs to them. A bottom-up approach is a clinical method. That's, I believe, the highlight of this article for me is a bottom-up approach that she identified. This is a clinical method that therapists use present-day bodily sensation as an entry point for trauma processing. So instead of starting with a visual or narrative memory, using our present-day bodily sensation as an entry point. The first level will begins with the body as a primary entry point. Instead of asking the client to recount a visual or verbal memory of the traumatic events, the therapist anchor the work in a present-day bodily experience, such as numbness, fatigue, or chest tightness. Then the therapist leans into these physical symptoms by asking to bridge a bridging question. If that sensation had a memory or a belief, what might it be linked to? If the sensation, physical symptoms, or that sensation had a memory or a belief, what might it link to? This question gently moves the client into the second level, which is the physical sensation bridge into an associated emotions, because the body holds the implicit learning of past relational trauma and developmental neglect. Focusing on the physical symptoms safely draws out the hidden affective states such as profound sadness, fear, or a sense of isolation. That body has been carrying as a survival strategies, and then by doing so, then we can draw those affect states out. And then finally, this emotional connection will unlock the third level, the activation of the underlying implicit memory network. By traversing from physical sensation to emotions, the client's nervous system safely accesses the deeply encoded memories and core negative beliefs that were locked away previously. The next article is written by Francis Waters, Annie Monaco, and M. Beckley Forrest. It's called the STAR Theoretical Model and its implication to EMDR treatment of youth with complex trauma. And this is a comprehensive framework designed to guide therapists in treating children and adolescents with complex trauma and dissociation. And I was very happy to read this article because working with children and adolescents wasn't my forte. So very happy to learn a lot of things from here, especially the Virginia Satir model. Virginia Satir is like literally my idol. And then I learned so much from her ideal in terms of the problem in the past. The problem now is the solution in the past from Virginia Satir. So I was very happy and glad to read this article. In this article, the author described that severe maltreatment and unpredictable caregiving often force children into survival mode. And so to map out the healing process, this model visualized treatment as a 5-point star, with each point representing a foundational psychological or biological theory. Point one is attachment theory. When a child's caregiver is both a source of comfort and source of terror, it leads to what John Bowlby called a splitting of the ego. That is, there is a different self states will emerge, holding contradictory feelings such as craving for connection while also act as angry protectors or pseudo parents. The second point is dissociation theory. Dissociation is recognized as a vital defense mechanism. It allows the children to safely compartmentalize overwhelming pain and fear. However, dissociation will lead to abrupt shift in behavior when trauma reminds or triggers those defense self states later in life. The third star is child development theory, and they draw from Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages. According to them, unresolved trauma can arrest fragmented self states at an early developmental stage, and will trapping that part of the child in feeling of deep shame, distrust, or guilt. And the fourth point of the star, integrate neurobiology. Crucially, a child's different self states exhibit entirely distinct autonomic nervous system responses. For example, an aggressive protector state might activate a sympathetic fight response, while frightened inner child state collapse into a parasympathetic freeze. Finally, the point five is family system theory, specifically Virginia Satir theory. This point emphasizes that a child's symptoms reflect the broader pain or dysfunction within their family. Therefore, treating a dissociative child in isolation is ineffective. The entire family system must be involved. So what are the implications for EMDR therapy? According to Len, because the dissociative use often lack a coherent autobiographical narrative and struggle with severe internal fragmentation, standard EMDR protocols are simply just not enough. So during the preparation phases, EMDR must become highly experiential and play-based. Therapists can rely on projective tools like Sentry, miniatures, puppets, and dissociative dolls to help the child to map out their internal self states and understand their protective rules. And then establishing not just one standard safe place. According to them, just one safe space is rarely sufficient. You want to have a different safe space for the different parts, meaning like different parts, ego states need a different safe space to feel secure. When it comes to the processing trauma memories, clinician must act as a keen observer of the child's autonomic nervous system, tailoring your intervention to each specific state's perception of safety. And processing relies heavily on sensory grounding, like dancing or moving, and playful bilateral stimulation to keep the child within their window of tolerance. Ultimately, EMDR therapists must turn parents into an active co-regulators. Parents are trained to manage their own emotional triggers and use sensory grounding, such as offering chewy candy or dropping a heavy object to break a dissociative trance, to forcefully orient their child's triggering self-state back to present-day safety. By uniting the entire family system, the child's fragmented states can safely heal and build a cohesive, integrated identity. The last article is from Jill Halsey. The title is Phase 1 as Clinical Foundation, Clarifying Processes and Decision-Making in EMDR Therapy with Complex Trauma. Halsey's framework for organizing phase 1 of EMDR therapy for clients with complex trauma, focusing on how clinicians can safely pace treatment and determine a client's readiness to process trauma memory. To translate a client's complex history into an actionable treatment plan, Halsey recommended using what he called the 5P framework. The first P stands for presenting difficulties. These are the specific symptoms and the problems that are currently disrupting the client's daily life and bring them into therapy right now. So by carefully exploring these issues, clinician can prioritize the client's immediate can prioritize their immediate intervention goals and then to anchor their pacing decisions in the client's present reality. The second P is precipitating factors, which are the current triggers. This might be a recent relational rupture or workplace conflict, and these are the reasons destabilize the client and activates older maladaptive memory network. So clarifying these triggers help identify early triggers for risk processing. The third P represents predisposing factors. And so these are the factors involve early relational experiences, chronic neglect, or repeated adversity that shape the client's core belief. These factors provide crucial developmental context. They should not be targeted prematurely before the client's internal resources and ego are sufficiently strengthened. The fourth P is perpetuating factors. Halsey identified as the most clinically decisive domain for pacing. These are the present patterns that maintain a client's distress, such as ongoing self-harm, severe sleep disturbance, or persistent dissociative coping. If these factors indicate the client's nervous system is operating near its threshold, trauma processing must be delayed in favor of stabilization. The final P is protective factors. These are the client's existing adaptive network, resiliency, and supportive relationship. By identifying the strengthening these factors will guide the preparation phase and provide the essential adaptive information needed to support the trauma processing later on. Ultimately, by organizing clinical data through the 5Ps, EMDR therapists will ensure their target sequence is not driven simply by emotional intensity or memory, but by a structured understanding of the client's present stability and developmental history. According to Jill Halsey, once the data is organized, how does a clinician decide if it is safe to begin processing? I think this is a really good thing because a lot of times a lot of clinicians will ask, how do I know when is it ready? What are the factors to decide? The first 5P allow us to organize the client's data and the presenting issues, the triggers, the what bring them in, and then their supportive system, and then their ongoing crisis or the issues. And after we get that data, Halsey emphasized that just because unprocessed memory exists doesn't mean it is time to process it. Determined readiness is a dynamic process that depends on 4 key variables. The first one is that you as a clinician must evaluate the stability of the client's affect regulation across sessions. If minor activation leads to a prolonged destabilization or sleep disturbance, uh, more stabilization is needed before trauma activation is introduced. The second one, clinicians need to assess the consistency of dual attention. Can the client maintain the present moment awareness while simultaneously accessing distressing materials? Or do they collapse into dissociative coping? If dual attention is lost, bilateral stimulation will amplify the fragmentation rather than promoting the integration. The third one is that therapists need to look at the interaction of perpetuating factors with current stressors. That is, if a client is actively dealing with severe insomnia or relational instability, immediate trauma processing may simply intensify their dysregulation. Finally, readiness depends on accessibility of protective adaptive experiences. That is the AIP models, adaptive information processing network, the adaptive one. Does the client have a reliable sense of safety, competence, or connection to support them? So by rigorously applying the 5 Ps and assessing these dynamic readiness factors, EMDR clinician can ensure that their pacing decisions are anchored in structured clinical data, making trauma processing safe, sustainable, and truly integrative. Wow, that is a lot. I realized that I already talked about 30 minutes. Originally, I just want to do 1 minute for each article, but there's no way to condense the rich information into 1 minute for each article. So I hope you all will pick up the magazine and read through it because I definitely leave out a lot of important details. So in part of the video, I'm going to summarize 2 articles from a very important person's work. Well, at least for me, this is a very important person's work, and the work is very important. So I will also summarize the common themes from all of these articles and to compare with the New Haven trauma treatment standard. Thank you all for watching this video. Head down to the comments and let's build a resource together. What is the biggest difficulty you face when you using EMDR with complex trauma? And what specific adaptation have you found most helpful? And if you find this deep dive helpful, please like and subscribe so we can keep having these conversations. Take care of yourself this week and then keep up with the great work you are doing out there. I will see you next time.